He was just a child holding a sandwich, so why did Sophie scream like she'd seen a ghost? Leonard's heart froze as his daughter's tiny hand clenched his sleeve, her voice trembling as she pointed across the street. "Daddy. That's my brother." The words struck him like an unexpected gust of wind. Confused, Leonard followed her finger, expecting maybe a classmate, a homeless man, or even a street performer dressed as a superhero. Instead, he saw a boy 6 years old at most standing alone on the sidewalk with dirt smudged across his cheeks and dried tears lining his face like cracked paint. His small hands gripped a half-eaten sandwich, as if letting go meant losing his last connection to survival. His jacket hung off him like a curtain 2 sizes too big, and his shoes were mismatched and worn. Leonard blinked. The boy stared back, cautious, silent, unreadable. Leonard looked down at Sophie, his perfect, curly-haired daughter in a lilac dress and white stockings, her hair neatly pinned with a pink bow. The contrast was almost surreal. She looked like spring. The boy looked like winter. "You don't have a brother," Leonard said calmly, brushing her hand down. "Yes, I do," Sophie whispered, not looking away. "Mommy said he's real, and I saw him." "In my dreams," Leonard's jaw tightened. "Not here. Not now." The paparazzi often lurked around his high-end bistro, and the last thing he needed was a scene. He was supposed to meet the mayor's office for brunch, shake hands with investors, pose for glossy photos in front of the golden entrance to Hart & Co. The restaurant bore his name, his pride. He built it from nothing, he'd always believed. In control of the kitchen, of his reputation, of his life. But none of that mattered right now because his daughter was trembling, not from fear, but recognition. She stepped forward before he could stop her. "Hi," she called softly too. The boy, crossing the narrow sidewalk, Leonard grabbed her shoulder instinctively. "Sophie, no, stay close, but he's hungry. I'm sure someone's already helping him." "No one is," she said, voice firmer now. "Look at him." Leonard did, and for the first time in years, something inside him stirred something. He'd buried long ago, back when his ex-wife, Camilla, left with their newborn and disappeared from his world for nearly 3 years. When she returned broken, distant, and sick, she brought only Sophie. The boy across the street stared at Sophie with wide eyes, like he recognized her too. He said nothing. Just shifted his feet and clutched the sandwich tighter, as if afraid someone would take it away. Leonard stepped forward now, slowly, unsure of why he was even moving. "Hey kid," he called, trying not to sound too stern. "You okay?" The boy didn't answer. He took a step back, eyes darting between Leonard and Sophie. That's when Leonard noticed his left hand bore a small scar across the knuckle. A crescent-shaped mark that looked oddly familiar. He had one just like it. So did Sophie. Leonard blinked again. The image began to burn into his mind, and for the first time he felt cold. A waiter stepped outside from the restaurant and broke the moment. "Mr. Hart, the table's ready. The guests are asking for you." Leonard turned, distracted. "Give me a minute." "Of course, sir." When he looked back, the boy was gone. He scanned the street, nothing, just moving cars, polished storefronts, and an empty patch of sidewalk where the child had stood. Where did he go? Sophie asked urgently. Leonard shook his head. He probably walked away. No, Sophie insisted. He always runs when someone comes near. He's scared. Leonard crouched beside her. "Sweetheart, I think you're just imagining things. Maybe a dream felt real, but it wasn't a dream," she said, her little fists balled now. "Mommy told me when she was sick, she said he was taken away. That I'd see him one day and I'd know." Leonard's heart twisted. Sophie had never mentioned this before. Camilla had died nearly a year ago, her final weeks lost in a fog of medication and hushed conversations. He'd been so focused on protecting Sophie from the grief that he never asked her what Camilla had said in those quiet moments. "Did she say his name?" Leonard asked gently. Sophie nodded. She said, "I didn't." She said he looked just like me. Leonard stood abruptly. The name shot through his veins like fire. Camilla had refused to talk about the past. When he demanded answers years ago, she told him the second baby hadn't survived the birth. That was the end of it. No grave, no paperwork, just silence. He'd buried the pain, buried the doubt, and now here was Sophie, pointing to a child who could have been her mirror. "Come inside," Leonard said quickly, trying to pull her along. Sophie resisted. "He's cold, Daddy." Leonard's voice trembled with restraint. "Sophie, please." She obeyed reluctantly, but as they stepped through the gold-trimmed doors of Hart & Co., Leonard looked over his shoulder one last time. The boy was watching them from behind a newspaper stand, still holding the sandwich, still holding a question Leonard didn't want to answer. The city outside had gone to sleep, but Leonard Hart's mind was wide awake, haunted by the echo of his daughter's voice. "Daddy, that's my brother." The words refused to quiet down. They repeated in loops, chipping away at the walls he had built around his past. Sophie had gone to bed early that night, unusually quiet. She hadn't touched her dinner, just stared at her plate and whispered, "He's cold, Daddy, he's cold." Leonard tried to distract her with bedtime stories and lullabies, but she clung to his arm like she was afraid he might disappear too. Now, the silence in the penthouse felt thick, suffocating. Leonard poured himself a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it. He stood in the study, staring at the tall mahogany bookshelf that held more secrets than stories. Behind the lowest shelf he knew was the trunk he had never opened, Camilla's trunk. After she died, the lawyers had handed it over like it was a final piece of baggage he had to carry. But he never touched it. Too many memories, too many what-ifs. She had left it to him in her will with one line written in her unmistakably elegant cursive, "For Leonard. He deserves to know." For years, he had ignored it, buried it under old tax files and real estate contracts. But tonight, something felt different, that boy's eyes. Sophie's certainty. Camilla's silence. Leonard knelt down and pulled the trunk free. It was heavier than he remembered, dust coating its brass locks. He hesitated only a moment before unlocking it. The scent of old linen and perfume rose as he opened the lid. The first layer was familiar baby clothes, Sophie's hospital bracelet, Camilla's silk scarf he once bought in Florence. But beneath those, nestled in a manila folder, was a sealed envelope. It was yellowed with age. On the front, in Camilla's handwriting, were 5 words that made Leonard's throat dry: "Confidential for Leonard only." His hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside, there was a single photograph, faded but clear enough to rip the ground from beneath him. It was Camilla, in a hospital gown, smiling warily. In her arms were 2 tiny infants swaddled tightly, one with a pink cap, the other with blue. Their hospital bracelets were visible. Baby A, Baby B. Leonard's vision blurred. He turned the photograph over. On the back, scrawled hastily, "Sophie and Aiden, born 8 minutes apart." Aiden. He stumbled backward, the envelope slipping from his hand and falling to the floor like a feather with the weight of 1,000 bricks. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. The room seemed to tilt, he remembered. That night, the day Sophie was born, Camilla was rushed to a private facility. He wasn't allowed in for most of the labor. They told him there were complications. When he finally saw Camilla, she was pale, barely conscious, and the staff had only brought one child, Sophie. When he asked where the other was, they told him the second baby hadn't made it. And Camilla? She never spoke of it again. Leonard dropped to the floor, picking up every document from the envelope. There were more scans of medical bills, strange receipts, and one official-looking birth certificate only partially filled out. Aiden Hart, it read, but the field for the father's name was blank. He gripped the sides of his head, trying to breathe. His wife had lied to him. All those years, she had robbed him of a son. And yet, why? In the envelope was one final item, a letter, handwritten, unfinished. The ink was smudged in places, as if Camilla had cried while writing it. "Leonard, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I lied to you. I told you Aiden didn't survive because I was afraid. Afraid you would love him more. Afraid he'd take your attention. You always wanted a son so badly, and I couldn't bear to share you. So I made arrangements. I gave him away. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be temporary until I got better, until I could face you. But things spiraled. I didn't know they would lose him. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sophie knows more than she should. If she ever says she saw him, believe her. I know you'll find him. I believe you will. He deserves to know his father. Forgive me, Camilla." The letter ended there. Mid-sentence, Leonard felt something sharp twist in his chest. He had been robbed of 6 years. Not just of moments with his son, but of choices, of truth, of love. He stood up, clutching the photograph in one hand and the letter in the other. His face, usually composed like marble, was now cracked and raw. He walked to Sophie's room, quietly pushing open the door. She was asleep, her arms wrapped around her stuffed giraffe. Her chest rose and fell in slow rhythm. He stepped closer, sitting gently on the edge of her bed. He whispered, "Sophie, sweetheart." Her eyes fluttered open. "You were right," he said. "His name is Iden." She didn't smile, she just nodded. "I knew it," she whispered back. Leonard kissed her forehead, then stood. Downstairs, the city lights still glittered like stars on the pavement. Somewhere out there, his son was alive, hungry, cold, alone, and Leonard Hart was no longer the man who could ignore that. The air in Queens was different, denser somehow. The streets were narrower, quieter, lived in a way Leonard Hart hadn't felt in years. His polished shoes tapped against the cracked concrete walkway as he approached the faded brownstone. There were no golden handles here, no valet parking or mirrored fads. Just peeling paint, flower pots with dry soil, and a rickety buzzer that hadn't worked properly in a decade. But the nameplate still read Hargrove. Leonard stood there for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the button. What was he even hoping to find? Answers? Forgiveness? A miracle? He finally pressed it. A few seconds later, a familiar, raspy voice came through the static speaker. "Yes? It's Leonard Hart," he said, steadying his breath, "from years ago. I need to talk to you. It's about Sophie and something else." There was a pause, then a loud buzz. The door clicked open. Mrs. Hargrove looked smaller than he remembered, as if age had whittled her down. She wore a lavender cardigan with mismatched buttons and house slippers too soft to make noise, but her eyes, sharp and gray like mist over a lake, were the same. She opened the door wider, saying nothing, and gestured for him to come in. The apartment was filled with the scent of chamomile tea and mothballs. The walls were lined with photographs, mostly black and white people long gone, frozen in happier times. Leonard's heart panged when he noticed a small framed photo of Sophie as a toddler, sitting on Mrs. Hargrove's lap, laughing, chocolate smeared on her cheeks. She had kept it all these years. He sat stiffly on the couch as Mrs. Hargrove poured tea with shaking hands. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said quietly. "Not after Camilla." Leonard nodded. "I'm not here about the past. At least, not the parts we already know." She set the cup down and looked him straight in the eyes. "Then you found the photo, didn't you?" That stopped him cold. "How did you?" "I always knew you would, one day," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Camilla was reckless, but she wasn't cruel. She left pieces behind, hoping you'd follow the trail if she couldn't carry the truth herself." Leonard took out the photo, the one with Camilla holding both babies, and placed it on the table between them. "She told me he died, that Iden didn't survive the birth." Mrs. Hargrove let out a breath that sounded like a confession she'd been holding for years. She reached for the photo with shaking fingers. "That boy. Iden. He was so quiet. Even as a newborn, but strong. I held him. I sang to him when Camilla wouldn't." Leonard leaned in. "Why didn't you say anything?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because she paid me not to." The words were like a slap. Mrs. Hargrove continued, voice cracking. "She came to me one night, desperate. Said she couldn't raise two children. Said if you found out she had a son, you'd spoil him and forget Sophie. I told her she was being paranoid, but she was convinced. She said she'd already arranged for the boy to be taken privately, no questions asked, no paper trail." Leonard's fists clenched. "Private adoption?" "She said it was temporary, just until she figured things out, but I never saw him again. I thought maybe she changed her mind, or maybe something went wrong." Leonard stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You helped her do this." "I was a nanny, Mr. Hart," she said, voice suddenly firmer. "Not a mother, not a wife. I didn't have power. I didn't have rights. I begged her to tell you. I held that child and I knew he was yours. But Camilla threatened to fire me. She said if I ever told you, she'd say I made it up. That I was losing my mind. So I kept quiet, and I've hated myself every day since." Leonard stared at the window, where dusty sunlight slanted across the floor. "I saw him yesterday, on the street, holding a sandwich like it was the only thing he owned." Mrs. Hargrove's breath hitched. "I didn't believe it at first," Leonard went on. "But Sophie, she knew." She pointed right at him and said, "That's my brother." Mrs. Hargrove's lips trembled. "She always Had her mother's instinct, Leonard turned to her. Do you know where he went? Who took him? Anything? She didn't answer immediately. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded slip of paper. I kept this, just in case. It was the only address I ever saw, scribbled on an envelope Camilla gave to the courier who came to take the baby. It's an old shelter in Brooklyn. I don't even know if it's still open. Leonard took the paper like it was gold. Why didn't you ever go looking for him? I was afraid of what I'd find, she whispered. But you're his father. You deserve to know him. He stood slowly, the paper clutched in his hand. If he's still there, I'll find him. I have to. Mrs. Hargrove placed her hand on his arm. Leonard, if you do find him, don't just bring him into your world like a guest. Make space for him. Real space in your heart, in your home. Leonard nodded, eyes glistening. I will, as he walked back into the fading light of the city. The slip of paper in his coat pocket burned against his chest like a second heartbeat. He had lost 6 years. He would not lose a 7th. The faded green paint on the shelter's front door peeled like old scabs, revealing the splintered wood beneath. A rusted bell above the entrance let out a tired jingle as Leonard Hart stepped inside, the city's noise shutting behind him like a slammed door. The air was thick with the scent of stale bread, cleaning chemicals, and something else, something harder to name. It was the scent of forgotten lives, of kids left behind. Leonard's polished shoes looked out of place against the worn linoleum tiles, but he didn't care. He clutched the paper Mrs. Hargrove had given him like it was his final lifeline. Sophie walked beside him, her little hand wrapped around his, her eyes darting across the room with quiet urgency. A tired woman behind the counter, mid-50s, with curly graying hair and deep-set eyes, looked up from a clipboard. She gave him a brief glance, then returned to her paperwork. Leonard cleared his throat. I'm looking for a boy. I think he was brought here about a year ago. No parents, no records, just a bracelet. The woman's pen froze mid-sentence. She looked up again, her expression sharpening. What did the bracelet say? Leonard pulled a photo from his coat pocket. It was the same one Camilla had left behind Sophie and her brother swaddled side by side. He placed it gently on the counter. Baby B. Her lips parted slightly. A shadow crossed her face. Wait here, she said, disappearing through a door behind her. Sophie tugged at Leonard's sleeve. What if he's scared of us now? Leonard knelt beside her. Then we'll help him feel safe again. I promise, eh? Few minutes later, the woman returned. He's here, she said, voice softer now. We call him Iden, no last name. He was found in a park, cold, hungry, no ID, just the bracelet. He barely spoke at first. Leonard's breath hitched. Can I see him? She hesitated. We try not to overwhelm the kids, especially ones with trauma, but I'll ask him to come out. She disappeared again and silence filled the room. Sophie clung tighter to Leonard's hand. Then, through the doorway, he emerged. It was him, the boy from the sidewalk, same haunted eyes, same oversized coat, same wary posture. He stepped into the room cautiously, his gaze flicking around until it landed on Sophie. She broke free from Leonard's grasp and ran toward him, stopping just a few feet away. It's you, she whispered. Breathless, Iden stared at her. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and he whispered back, You came. Leonard's throat tightened. He took a slow step forward, hands raised, voice barely audible. Iden, do you remember this? He pulled out the small hospital bracelet he had carried since the night he found the photo. It was yours, from the day you were born. Iden looked down at his own wrist, then back up at Leonard. Without a word, he extended his hand and peeled back the sleeve. There it was, the other bracelet, faded, cracked, but still legible. Baby B. Leonard dropped to his knees, a gasp leaving his lungs like the air had been punched from him. He held both bracelets in his shaking hands. They matched. The director stepped closer, watching in stunned silence. Leonard looked up at Iden, his eyes brimming. I'm your father, he said. I didn't know you were out here. I thought you, his voice broke. I thought you were gone. Iden didn't say anything. He just looked at Sophie again, like she was the only thing that made sense in the entire room. She told me in her dreams, Iden said suddenly. She said you'd find me. Sophie nodded. I knew it. You were always close. The boy's lip quivered, and he wiped his nose with the sleeve of his coat. "I don't want to sleep on the floor anymore," he whispered. "It's always cold." Leonard reached out slowly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You won't? Not ever again." But Aiden didn't move. His body tensed. "Are you going to leave me too?" "No," Leonard said, his voice shaking. "I swear to you, Aiden, I will never leave you again." Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her brother. It was a quiet hug, small, soft, but it carried years of separation, of unspoken promises. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was a slow, unsteady sob rising from Leonard's chest. He'd lived a life of success, of elegance and control, but in this dingy shelter lobby, kneeling on the floor between his two children, he had never felt more human. The shelter director stepped forward gently. "There will be paperwork. Assessments. But I've worked here a long time, Mr. Hart, and I've never seen something like this." Leonard nodded, still overwhelmed. "I'll do whatever it takes." She glanced down at Aiden, then at Sophie. "They need time, both of them. But they've already found each other again. That's more than most kids here ever get." Leonard looked at his son. "Can I take you home?" Aiden hesitated, then nodded slowly. As they walked out of the shelter together, the boy paused at the door. He looked back just once at the place that had held his silence, his cold nights, his questions. Then he reached up and took Leonard's hand. It fit perfectly. The golden glow of Hart and Co. shimmered across the marble floors. The crystal chandeliers casting gentle halos onto the tables dressed in white linen and silver cutlery. The restaurant buzzed faintly in the background, soft jazz humming through. The speakers, servers gliding silently between tables, glasses clinking like delicate wind chimes. Everything looked perfect, everything always did. But Leonard Hart wasn't thinking about ambience or reservations. He was thinking about the boy sitting across from him, barely tall enough for his chin to clear the edge of the table, shoulders hunched inside a borrowed sweater, eyes darting nervously around the room like he didn't belong. Aiden, his son. Sophie sat beside her brother, holding his hand tightly, whispering silly things to distract him. She had already ordered him mac and cheese and a small apple juice on the rocks, giggling when the waiter had smiled and played along. She was trying so hard to make Aiden feel safe, but Leonard knew it would take more than jokes and warm food to fill the 6-year void in that child's heart. A waiter approached quietly with a wine bottle and 2 glasses. Leonard nodded politely, giving the boy a reassuring glance. "You okay with all this?" Aiden shrugged. "It's big and clean." Leonard chuckled softly, but the boy's eyes stayed fixed on his lap, unsure, uncertain. "If it's too much, we can go somewhere else," Leonard offered, leaning forward. "Anywhere you want." Aiden shook his head. "No. I like it, just weird." "Yeah," Leonard said, his voice dipping. "Weird for me too." The waiter poured the wine and disappeared like a shadow. Leonard reached for his glass, his fingers barely gripping the stem when Aiden suddenly looked up and asked, almost in a whisper, "Are you really my dad?" The question stopped time. Leonard's heart gave a violent, staggering lurch. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the pristine floor, red wine spilling like blood across the marble. Every conversation in the restaurant went quiet. Every head turned, but Leonard didn't care. He was frozen, breath caught somewhere between his throat and his soul. Sophie gasped softly. "You are, Daddy, you are." Leonard slowly stood, knees trembling, hands shaking not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. A raw, aching guilt that roared through his chest like a storm. He looked at Aiden, at those familiar eyes, at that face that mirrored his own. And suddenly, the weight of every missed birthday, every winter night that Aiden had spent alone, every bedtime story he'd never read, every hug he'd never given crashed down on him all at once. His legs buckled, he collapsed to the floor. Right there in the center of his own empire, tears flooded his eyes, not the quiet kind, but the kind that erupted when a dam finally breaks. His hands covered his face, the sobs tearing out of him uninvited, unstoppable. He had built this restaurant, this life, this name thinking he had done everything right, but none of it mattered because he had been living half a life. Guests began to whisper. Staff stood awkwardly at a distance, but Sophie didn't hesitate. She slid down from her chair and rushed to her father's side, wrapping her arms around him. Iden stood motionless for a moment then, as if guided by instinct he didn't yet trust, stepped forward and crouched beside them. He didn't say anything. He just placed his tiny hand on Leonard's back, and that was enough. Leonard looked up, eyes red and voice cracked. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. Iden didn't flinch. You didn't leave me? Leonard's voice broke again. No, I would never have left you. Iden nodded, his chin quivering. Okay. They stayed like that for a while, three people on a floor meant for millionaires, surrounded by silence that no one dared interrupt. Eventually, Leonard stood slowly, wiping his face with a napkin offered by a kind-eyed waitress. Let's go home, he said, looking at them both. Our home, Sophie beamed. Iden gave a small, hesitant nod. Leonard turned to his staff. Close the restaurant for the night. The maitre d' blinked. Sir. There are still guests, tell them I've just found something far more important than business. He didn't wait for a response. He walked out, one child on each side, their hands clasped in his like anchors, pulling him back to what mattered. Outside, the city pulsed with light and life, but Leonard barely noticed. He wasn't thinking about the dinner rush, the wine list, or the Forbes interview he was supposed to give the next morning. He was thinking about bedtime stories, about finding a second toothbrush, about repainting Sophie's room into a room for two. That night, the penthouse no longer felt sterile or cold. Sophie showed Iden where the blankets were. Leonard made grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen, burned the first two, but the kids laughed, and that was enough. They all sat on the floor to eat, with no fancy plates, just paper towels and mismatched cups. And somehow, that felt more real than any meal Leonard had ever served on fine china. Later, as he tucked them into bed, Sophie on the left, Iden on the right, Iden looked up at him and asked, "Will I be here tomorrow too?" Leonard smiled through tears. "You'll be here every day, from now on." And for the first time in his life, Leonard Hart didn't feel like a millionaire. He felt like a father.